This podcast was recorded on traditional Denezaw land.
Hello and welcome to Before the Peace. I'm Jenna Moreland and I'm here with my co-host and producer of the podcast, Tre Lapushinsky.
Hello. And oh boy, what a conversation with Christy Jordan-Fenton. An author, a business owner, and an Indigenous advocate who grew up on a farm in Alberta. In this episode, we delve into Christy's journey growing up with a Cree-Metis stepfather who went to a residential school and her partnership with her mother-in-law, OleMaun, or Margaret. She was the inspiration behind the books they co-authored and was a residential school survivor as well.
Both Tre and I are Métis, and we're both on our own journeys of discovering more about our identity and our own Métis heritage. And we actually find ourselves struggling with a lot of the same issues, even though we are very different and we have very different stories, which means there are more people out there who might feel this way. And maybe for you, it isn't about your ethnicity. Maybe your struggles are with sexuality or your religious views or maybe your political views.
Before we even put out our first episode, we talked about identity and we were looking at who we can talk to because this is something very important to ourselves. And this is something that we needed someone who might relate to us. And we felt that Christy, through her life, she might have within herself felt some identity issues, and she delves into a little bit in this episode, specifically when we're talking about our identities. And she also talks about someone who might be struggling outside of us or herself, what they might do or what she would say to them. This episode just means so much to me, and I believe it does with Jenna as well. And we also get a little bit more personal in the episode, which we haven't in past episodes. Usually, it's just we're asking questions, we're talking, we're having a conversation, but we don't go in too much about ourselves, and I think this one kind of opens that up a bit for anyone that's interested, just to let you know that's going to be happening.
And of course, this podcast wouldn't be possible without the help of Troyer Ventures. Troyer's been serving our community and the energy industry with tank and vac trucks since 2000. They're built on the principles of hard work, service, and community, and they're proud to offer the financial support to make this program possible.
Let's get right into it. Here's Christy Jordan-Fenton.
You were raised by a Cree-Metis stepfather who went to a residential school. When did you first learn of residential schools?
So I was raised by a Cree-Metis man from Green Lake, Saskatchewan, and he was a residential school survivor. It wasn't something that he was able to talk about very much, though there was a lot of things left over from having been at residential school. I lived in communities where a lot of my friends' parents and grandparents had been to residential school, so I was one of the, few settler people who grew up with an awareness about residential school. But most of the stories I had heard were really horrific stories that we're starting to hear now. These are things that have always been talked about in Indigenous circles and weren't a secret. So growing up with a Cree-Metis stepbrother and stepsister, seeing that they didn't think that being Cree was as cool as I thought it was. I thought it was cool. We'd go camping. And my stepfather built this big tent city, and we'd be making bannock on a stick, and he just knew all this bushcraft, and I thought that was really awesome. But they didn't see that the same way. So when I met my ex-husband, he was half Inuvik. It was really important for me when I had children that they wouldn't grow up feeling that same way. And I think part of the reason I thought that people felt that way or young people felt that way is because they never seen images of themselves in a positive light. And if they did, it was always like the Pocahontas, which was nothing like any Indigenous person I've ever met, even remotely. Or it was the Indigenous people always losing. So I thought one way that I could help them feel good about themselves and sort of insulate them against racism that they would encounter, obviously, in their lives, was if they saw their grandmother as their biggest hero. So I started asking her for stories. And also, us living in the territory of the Denezaw, which is where I met Margaret, where I had my children, we were at a territory, and they weren't in the territory of Inuvik. So I wanted them to know about their culture. And so she told me stories about hunting polar bears and wolves and traveling by dog sled and just the most amazing stories you could imagine for an upbringing. And then my curiosity in that, so that I could make sure my children knew, that led then to her feeling safe enough to open up and start talking about her residential school experiences. So when we did start writing her residential school experiences, there was still always that in my mind that I didn't want my children to think, oh, like, you know, my poor grandma went to this residential school and it was so bad for her. I wanted them to think, wow, my grandma's really tough. She went through this unbelievable experience and she was her own hero at a really young age. So I guess that's kind of where writing the stories about Margaret came from. Also writing Fatty Legs, it's really for around grade, like around, I guess like grade 6 to grade 8, sort of can be read by younger grades and older grades. But I don't think it's coincidental that I ended up writing it for the same age I was when I started getting very curious about residential school and why my stepfather was struggling with some of the things that he was. So maybe in a way, I wasn't just writing it for my children, but maybe my child self.
Yeah, I think the book not only talks about the residential school side of it, but it also talks about bullying. There's a lot of other references that kind of, I don't know, people can relate to. And she persevered through all of that anyways. When the book was first released, was Margaret OleMaun, was she surprised by how many people could relate to her?
Very, very, very surprised. She only gave in to me writing her story because she said nobody was ever going to publish it. And that even if they did publish it, nobody was going to read it. So it was something I would get out of my system and she wouldn't hear about it anymore and it'd be over with. And now we're actually at the 12th anniversary. We had a 10th anniversary edition published, but 12th anniversary, there's a music video. There's been several musical productions. She traveled all over. We went to Havana, Alaska, Seattle, all over the place, and all over Canada, from coast to coast to coast. And she had never expected that was going to happen. She didn't think anybody would care about her story.
It's pretty wild what she would have seen in her lifetime, from where she came from to what she, oh my gosh, it's just so cool. And so during my research, I watched a video of you speaking about like the clothing that they made them wear at the residential school and how the outsiders wanted them to live and dress like they were in London or Paris. Hence the dresses and the stockings and stuff like that. But they weren't in London. They were by a freezing ocean. And so you said that one of the most important things we have is our own common sense, and forcing the children to wear clothing that wasn't suitable for the weather made them second guess their instincts. How did that affect OleMaun in her adult years?
Yeah, I think anybody that I've ever met who went to residential school, there is that sometimes questioning or sometimes doing things that don't necessarily make sense because you're told that this is the way it should be. And beyond the common sense and the questioning what was common sense is that erasure of ancestral knowledge. Each generation came up with a better and a better and a better way to live in the Arctic, where the ocean was freezing for at least 10 months of the year. And when the outsiders came and the settlers came, their ancestral knowledge was, like you said, how to live in Paris or London. It made sense for there, but it didn't make sense for here. And it erased that knowledge. They were taught to devalue the knowledge of their ancestors, when really, even today, scientists are finding that, like, caribou fur, for example, is one of the warmest materials on Earth. They don't have synthetics that are that warm, but the outsiders thought they knew better. So for several generations, it wiped out that it wiped out that ancestral knowledge. It almost erased it. It made people devalue their own common sense. You see younger generations, though, that are really revitalizing it. There's a number of amazing Indigenous academics who are doing things like studying the ancestral knowledge of, like, how warm is caribou fur, things like that, bringing that back.
Do you think it made her question just like everyday decisions more?
I do think that she was like a really remarkable woman, because she was very strong, very determined, knew her own mind in a lot of ways. But I did see sometimes where she maybe felt unsure or felt uncomfortable in situations, probably didn't let, like, people who weren't close to her wouldn't necessarily have seen that. She always came across as very confident. But I know even when we go to school visits and at nighttime when we were like back in a hotel and sharing a hotel room and debriefing about the day and different things, that she wasn't sure that it went that well, or that she made the right decision, and feeling unsure about that. But she always came across as a confident person, even if she did have things going on inside. I think she navigated it a lot better than most people who went through that experience, though.
So based off Fatty Legs and just the story, it seemed OleMaun was very immersed in her culture before going to the residential school. Now, coming out of it, she didn't know her own language. You know, she looked a lot different. Her mother didn't even recognize her. Did it take her some time to get back into her culture, to get back into her language, to be in the place that she should be in, that she grew up? And how long kind of did it take her? Did it still affect her for years afterwards?
Yeah, it because she wasn't allowed to speak her own language for that whole time she was at the school, she lost her ability to access the portion of her brain where that was stored. She lost those pathways. She said it took about 6 months to be able to just fluently speak. When she did relearn her language, she made sure she never lost it again. So, that was about 6 months. She had to relearn to be able to stomach her traditional foods, which are actually pretty yummy. But she, after having this bland diet of cabbage soup and oatmeal, bland oatmeal, that was difficult. And she had missed out on a lot of the learning that would have been important for a young woman, cultural learning, things around hunting and fishing and different things like that, that she missed those rites of passage she should have been going through. So she had to catch up on all of that. And when she relearned that, she made sure that she definitely did not ever lose that again.
And based on the struggles she's had, you even described her. She was a strong, determined woman. Now thinking about the thousands and thousands of Indigenous children that were in these schools, do you ever kind of look at it like, some of them didn't have this trait and how it affected them? Do you think, kind of what are your thoughts on that when you kind of put it in a bigger perspective of all the kids and kind of what we know now?
Yeah. Well, Margaret was fortunate that, she wasn't fortunate that she went to school, but she was fortunate that she was 8 years old before she went to school. Many residential schools, children were leaving. The average was between 4 and 14 years old, and they might be there the whole time. So Margaret went at 8. She was able to have quite a bit of cultural foundation before she went. So I think that probably helped. And then after 2 years, went home and spent another year at home. For a lot of people who went to residential school, especially for a really long time, they go back to their communities. And the whole purpose of residential school wasn't so much what they wanted the children to learn. It was what they didn't want them to learn, which was that ancestral knowledge, so that they could. It was part of removing children from the land and removing Indigenous peoples from the land. So they would go home. They couldn't communicate with their families. If you couldn't communicate with your grandparents, you couldn't learn that ancestral knowledge that you needed to survive off the land. Indigenous children were expected to really have a sense of taking initiative, and they are expected, even today, you see a job that needs to be done. You don't wait for somebody to tell you, you get off your butt and you go and do it. But at the schools, you couldn't hardly breathe without getting permission first, and you would be punished really severely. So I've heard of lots of elders talking about going home, and they would see something needed to be done, but they would stand there and wait to be asked to do it or get permission. And that was interpreted as they were lazy or they were stupid. And so this became really shaming. Margaret had a close relationship with her father and with her grandparents. She was able to fit back in, but a lot of people were not able to. Then the purpose of residential school really was to get the children off the land and into the cities doing jobs that nobody else wanted to do, basically. So when they went home and there was this whole disconnect with culture, that happened to a lot of people. I really think the other heroes are, for example, my elders, I do Lakota ceremony with the Kainai Blackfoot, and I guess the majority of the elders there would be Kainai Blackfoot, but we also have elders from other areas as well, many of them residential school survivors, and to know how much they had to fight to either retain or regain language and culture, and then to be strong enough to pass that on, not only to the next generations, but also somebody like myself coming from outside is absolutely heroic. If it wasn't for those people like Margaret or like my elders who worked so hard to hang on to that and then to pass it on, we would have lost infinite knowledge that is really important for us living today.
In the book, you, at the very beginning, there's a very well-written paragraph on a note on the right to silence, and I'm just going to read it right now for everybody to hear. The authors would like to ask the readers to be mindful of the right to silence. While Margaret OleMaun is open about sharing her experiences at residential school, it is important to stress that many residential school survivors will not wish to talk about or revisit what they have experienced. Best practices include respecting their silence. This extends to all experiences of Indigenous trauma. We are overwhelmed by the level of inquisitiveness that has replaced a century and a half of horrific secrecy, but encourage those who want to know more to seek out sources where knowledge has been shared freely and to accept what is shared on the terms by which it is given. And I just think that that's really important for everyone to hear, because there is so much inquisitiveness right now, and a lot of it is coming from a good place, but that doesn't always mean that you have the right to ask, I guess. So I just think that this is very well written, and thank you for writing it.
I do have to give credit to the idea of right to silence comes out of Colombia. When they started their truth and reconciliation process, there was a lot of mental health workers and different people saying, well, talk about your experiences, talk about what happened, with warfare and everything going on. And some of the women in the villages said, you know what, we don't want to talk about it. We've lived it, and now we're out of it, and we just want to. So they had this movement where they said, and it's still going on, they just wanted to dance and sing. And they had a song that they dance and sing to that basically says, we don't want to cry anymore. We just want to live and be happy and dance and sing. And I was really glad that I was introduced to that concept. And I think this goes back to that, the positive experiences. Like Richard Wagamis was a mentor of mine. And I know that he said, and this was taken way out of context, that his mother said that residential school wasn't all bad because she was able to keep a good house and she was very tidy. And we have to understand that for survivors, they're choosing how to frame their lives. You can't be stuck in trauma all the time. You can't move on with your life if you're stuck in that victimhood all the time. Some people like Margaret can delve into some of the rougher things that happen and claim that. For other people, it's like shutting the door to the bad things that happen and focusing on the good. And other people just don't want to revisit at all in any way or talk about it. What's happened now, these graves that are being found has not been a secret to anybody who's been, who went to a residential school, who's heard residential school stories. This has been known for quite a long time. But now the rest of the world is finding out. So everybody's very curious, and it's good that people find out. But I do have elders who've gone to residential school who all of a sudden their phones are being flooded with, can you come speak at our school, without an understanding of all this processing. Yes, it's been known for a long time that there's been these graves across Canada, but there wasn't, when it became public, this was like this whole new mourning and healing that needed to happen. And in the quest to know more about it, sometimes people haven't been very sensitive to supporting those people, even people who are already sharing their stories. They needed time to step back and process that, and there's not always been the sensitivity around that. We tend, as outsiders, to think that we have a right to these stories. It's part of our history, so we have a right, so we're going to do the right thing, and we're going to go extract these stories. But there's definitely needs to be a right to silence. Not everybody wants to talk about it, and I have seen so many times where people go up to an elder, someone who's a settler goes up to an elder and will say, oh, did you go to residential school? Were you abused there? It's just, and no concept of how really not okay that is to do that. That's not the way you open.
Insensitive, yeah.
It seems like common sense not to do that to me. I mean, I understand the curiosity, and maybe some people don't see that, but I mean, I feel like it's been well known, like even you saying, growing up in a smaller community with your stepfather who went to residential school, things get around in a smaller community, and still you didn't know much about a residential school because everyone's so tight-lipped, right?
Even when I speak to Indigenous children, I say, you might have a family member who went to residential school and now you've heard more about it. You're very curious about it, but be really careful how you approach the adults in your life who might have gone to residential school, and be prepared for them not to want to talk about it. And then you just give them a hug and say, that's okay, Coco, you don't have to talk about it. I know for when the Truth and Reconciliation Commission first began, and there was a lot of talk about it, at that time, a lot of people were ready to start telling their children about it, but couldn't use their own voice to do it. And I can't tell you how many elders came up to us and said that they used Margaret's story. They used Fatty Legs. They would get the book and give it to their children and say, my experiences were a little different. I went to a different school, but this is kind of what happened. Or even adult children who wanted to know what happened to their parents, using Fatty Legs as a sort of a segue into approaching their parents to talk about it a little bit more.
What we know in 2022, and have heard so many brave stories from residential school survivors, they each had their own story, obviously, but they were the same in the abuse and what kind of went on at the schools. And, some were unfortunately, they weren't able to survive through those times. A couple of years ago, there was a controversy at an Abbotsford school. You had commented on it through, I believe it was a CBC article, or it was just another outlet. A teacher was assigned children to write positives about residential schools after reading Fatty Legs. My question is, as more and more survivors share their stories, how important is it that they are told from a third party, such as a teacher, in a correct way, without misinformation, without being misinterpreted, while respecting right to silence of the survivors?
Like Justice Murray Sinclair, who was the head of, and Senator, who was the head of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, said that there needed to be space for people to share their positive stories as well. And Margaret sometimes told funny stories about residential school, and when we go speak to people would end up laughing. They would say that was so surprising, but we also have to put that in context. So those stories belong to the people who experience them, their families, if they want to have those, and they have the right to have those happy memories. But to put it in context, why did they have to be in those abusive situations in the first place? Children are children. No matter what, they're always going to make the best. They're always going to make the best of wherever they're at. Children that were raised in Holocaust camps and concentration camps came out with stories of the make-believe that they played. We think about, there's so many different horrific things that children have been through, but why did they have to go through that just to go to school? So just because there might be something positive that happened at the school doesn't make it okay. And I don't think that should ever be the focus on learning about residential school. And as I said, if people like Margaret wanted to share fun stories that happened at the school, that belongs to them. But I don't think that belongs to anybody outside that experience.
How long did it take her to open up and to really get to a point where she was okay with the story being out in the world?
To write Fatty Legs it took us 2 years from the time that I heard Margaret's story and started writing on paper until we had a book in hand. So a lot of that was Margaret being able to open up and share her story. That was a bit difficult. She had negotiated her own terms with her experiences and didn't necessarily want to talk about some of the more awful things that happened. Also, some of that I have to own, because I just felt so angry when I started finding out what happened. And this happened to Margaret, who I loved a lot, and it had happened to my stepfather. And I had to process that when I was trying to write as her and through her eyes. I was putting a lot of anger into it, which isn't the way children see the world. They're just so resilient. This is what's happening in my world, and I'll move through it. I did have to do a lot of research and then come back to Margaret with questions. And sometimes she'd talk about them and sometimes she wouldn't want to. I remember one time the editor, actually, Maggie DeVries, she had sent me some questions to ask Margaret. And so I went and asked her, and she's like, why do they want to know that? What are they doing? Writing a book? And then we both started laughing because I was like, yes, Margaret, we're writing a book. But I wish I had been a little bit even more patient, but there were times I had to be patient, and it was like a couple of weeks that I couldn't work on writing anything because Margaret didn't feel like talking about, or I had to get creative with the story, and Margaret would say, I'm not going to go there. I don't want to talk about that. So then I'd have to change the plot in a different direction and work around it because she had that right.
Yeah, that's so complicated. Like, writing is already hard enough, and then having like a co-writer, and then even the editing process. I can't even imagine. I hated going through the editing process, and just having to even have that extra element of having somebody else okay it as well. It must have been complicated, but the end result so gratifying.
And that was for 4 books.
Yeah. Well, we got much better after the first book. Every other book afterwards took around 6 months, sometimes less. So we definitely got a lot better at it. But I was very lucky in the beginning that Anik Press, who published Fatty Legs and the other books, paired me with Maggie DeVries, who has been, she's a settler woman, but her sister was one of the Picton victims. And she was very involved in the missing and murdered Indigenous women movement from quite early on, and really did a lot of advocating to have the police pay attention that these women were going missing. So she had an adopted sister who was Indigenous, who was a Picton victim. So I think she had spent a lot of time in Indigenous community and hearing people with their traumatic stories, and she mentored me not just in writing. She's a phenomenal writing professor, but she also mentored me a lot in how to approach Margaret with the stories and how to work with the stories. And I owe a lot to her for what she taught me.
With your experiences, what would you say to a non-Indigenous person who, after hearing about the 216, after hearing about all these stories that are coming out, and they're feeling that anger, what would you say to them to help them with that process?
Well, I think sometimes people feel anger because they feel responsible. If you weren't directly involved in the residential schools, there's no need to feel responsible. But we do have to recognize that the fallout of that, the removal of people from the land, that has enabled the settler community to have a lot of benefits, and people are still paying the price for that. So I always like to talk about moving forward from today. So there's nothing that you can do about what happened in the past, but if there's a Sisters in Spirit vigil going on, so people are walking to bring awareness about the missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls, and Two-Spirit people, show up, bring a case of water. If there is anything going on, just stop into your local friendship center or wherever it is you can and ask, like, is there something that I can do to help? Or, like I said, bring the case of water, donate the box of donuts, whatever it is. If you're feeling anger, it's probably because you feel guilt. You don't need to feel guilt. You can move that guilt into action and being a good ally, an accomplice, not just an ally, an accomplice.
I was wondering, when did Margaret start to want to change her name back to OleMaun? When did she start to consider that? Because that's a huge identity thing, because she was given Margaret when she was 8 years old. So what got her to that point?
Yeah, I think it had a lot to do. I want to say it was maybe around the time of when I was 8, when we started talking to younger classes and using when I was 8, because she's mostly referred to as OleMaun in that. And it was beautiful. It was the children that brought that back, because children would get mad at me for calling her Margaret. And, but living in Fort St. John, everybody we knew called her Margaret, and it would be like kind of strange if I was like, oh, I'm going to pick up OleMaun, and they didn't know who that was. So the children insisted on calling her OleMaun. They started writing her letters as OleMaun, and she really started claiming it back. She made her Facebook account. She used OleMaun for her Facebook account, and really took that name back. But she was like probably in her 80s already, or close to it, when she took that name back. Her birth name, I should mention, when her father registered her birth, he registered her as Margaret because there were laws that you couldn't register traditional names. And actually up until just a few years ago, there was a lot of complications with registering traditional birth names, especially if they had syllabics and characters that are not part of the alphabet that we standardly use. So, but that wasn't a name that she grew up using. And then, of course, she goes to school and they're like, you can't use your traditional name here. That's not what's on your birth certificate. And then going to school, everybody was calling each other by those Christian names. So they go back to their community. They keep using that. And then when she moved down to Fort St. John, the biggest thing on her mind probably was like, I just want to fit in and get along with my new husband's friends. And so to bring in a traditional name wouldn't have been something she wanted to do. She just wanted to be Margaret and fit in. But it was beautiful to see her reclaim her traditional name. She actually, she did more than that. So this is a little bit off topic, but when she went back home from residential school, her and her friend Agnes were helping out this older woman, this elder, and they would go and get her like blocks of ice to melt for drinking water and just bring her things she needed. So one day they show up there and the woman has out needle and thread and ink, and she wants to tattoo the girls. And being tattooed like on the chin and the face would be like an honor. And but not for Margaret and Agnes. They've now been to residential school. They're a lot more colonized. So they got terrified and they ran away. And she said she always felt so bad about that because the woman really wanted to honor her, but she was so scared to get her face tattooed. So she never did get her face tattooed. But one day we were in Vancouver. Margaret was already in her 80s. And we were on a book tour. And we always shared a hotel room together. And I could hear her up and pacing around really early in the morning. So I knew there's something on her mind. So I get up and I say, okay, what's going on, Margaret? And she said, I think I want to get a tattoo. And she had seen one of her granddaughters had gotten some traditional tattoos. And I said, do you know what you want to get? She said, yeah. So she described it to me and we drew it out and it was a symbol for caribou. And I said, Margaret, our school visits today are downtown Vancouver and we finish like at lunchtime and there's a ton of tattoo shops. So I got on, I think like Yelp or something and like searched for a tattoo shop and they had an opening and we went and Margaret got a traditional tattoo, but not on her face. She got it on her wrist. And then after that, the piercing woman who was there, a young woman, was I think it was either her parents or grandparents had been to residential school. She was Métis, covered in piercings, very cool woman, but covered in piercings. They get talking. She talked Margaret into finally getting her ears pierced. So in her 80s, Margaret got her ears pierced, but only after she got her tattoo. So my oldest daughter now has the same tattoo. And I believe that some of her other granddaughters have now gotten the same tattoo. And if they haven't yet, they're planning on it.
I wanted to bring this up over several episodes that we have done. And it's about, with us talking about identity, I think this is perfect. Nowadays, with all the stories coming out and all the knowledge coming out, I find it so neat that it's so accessible, like with TikTok. For instance, as you were talking about the tattoos, I just want to show you this for our listeners. We can describe it
I can already see without looking at Sheena Novalinga.
It is Sheena Nova.
Yes, it's Sheena Novalinga.
So she got her traditional tattoos on her face. And she's so beautiful. And
a Sephora model as well.
Yeah. Yeah, and I just want your opinion on, how, I believe she's younger than me, and I'm just turning 30 this month, right? Like, it's just coming out. It's so easy for the younger generation to go on TikTok and learn. What's your thoughts on that? To just the fact that I think it's part of the reconciliation process and the knowledge that's out there now.
I actually have started doing now school visits that aren't even a huge amount about fatty legs. It was about all the great, the new generation of youth and how they're reclaiming things with like TikTok and Instagram. And I totally love Sheena Novalinga. Her mom is also a really strong, beautiful woman who took her to go get her tattoos. She's a Sephora model now. The first Indigenous Sephora model was Serene Carson Fox, who has actually played Margaret. She's an actress and a dancer, and she's played Margaret. Also comes from a family with a residential school history. Sheena Novalinga will do makeup tutorials on how she clears where her tattoos are, but does her makeup is beautiful. Another really beautiful one is Tia Woods, who is Elder Cynthia Jim's daughter. Cynthia Jim is an elder and ceremony keeper, but she is also a residential school survivor. And her daughter does all sorts of videos on Indigenous culture, lots of hair teaching videos. And she's got one with her mom, which is a couple with her mom braiding her hair, but one of them she's talking. It's, they use the audio from other things, but it's like it's basically like telling her to be proud of her, that her eyes aren't blue. Which makes me emotional because my youngest child always had a big issue with not having the same eye color that I have. I have blue eyes. My youngest child, I always said, had eyes like river stones. So when I saw that, I like burst into tears, knowing that the young girl and her mom were making that. Her mom is a residential school survivor, and here she is like telling her to be proud of her brown eyes, which has always been a struggle with my youngest child to be proud of that. There are like so many amazing youth on TikTok right now, and a lot of them have their parents and grandparents even on TikTok sharing teachings. It's amazing.
Well, with Sheena Nova, is her and her mom, they do throat singing, which is the first time I've ever experienced that, and I just constantly watch it. Like, they just go back and forth, and it's just really beautiful. And, I don't know too much about throat singing, but I know it's a tradition for them, and it's just really cool to see that. Yeah, there's a bunch of TikTok personalities that I follow who are even from Edmonton like me. And, they're one of them, she's from Onion Lake, which is, I worked in Lloydminster, started my broadcasting career there. So it's kind of cool. Like, I almost feel close to them. And now where we're going with Before the Peace and talking to all these Indigenous peoples, it's really neat to know that I can get it anywhere. Like, I can learn at the drop of a hat by going on my phone, right? It's just really cool, I find. And I'm so excited for the younger generation. And with things coming out that are, traumatic and not as cool, but at the same token, you hear that, and then you can also learn more about the culture. I just find it's awesome right now. And
I love it too. Like, my oldest daughter is a content creator. I think she's on TikTok, but she's probably had her most success with Instagram by far. She loves experimenting with makeup, but she's always said, my face doesn't make sense. She's very pale. She's even paler than I am. Very white looking, but her face has very Inuk features. And she's always had a struggle with that. So we're actually in talks about doing a book that she's very into photography. So her traditional name is Kugyuk, which means swan. Emma Fenton is her name. And we're talking about doing a book where she loves photography, where she takes pictures of different people who are mixed race and who feel like their face doesn't make sense. But she does a lot of experimenting with self-photography and experimenting with makeup is her way to kind of reconcile that she feels like her face doesn't make sense.
I think it's so cool that this younger generation is just owning their identities so much differently than all of us did. It's just like, even the fact that this younger generation was part of the reason why she ended up changing her name back. Like, that is just so powerful. And like, I love that. Both me and Tre have struggled with the fact that, like, I am Métis, but I'm very white. I'm very pale. And I really struggled with, I guess, I never really fully understood my identity until I became a mom. And I think that's because I just didn't even really know what identity was, what it meant. I don't know, like, there's just so many nuances and levels to it. But I do think, especially growing up in the 90s in a small town, I lived down in Cranbrook growing up, so it's very similar, I would say, to Fort St. John in the size and everything like that. Residential schools weren't really talked about. A lot of things weren't really talked about, like sexuality. And it's just so different now. And I'm so happy for this younger group of kids coming up so that they have more access to just owning themselves.
Well, and I think we can learn a lot from, I don't know, sort of indigenizing the sense of identity. We really need to decolonize that sense of identity. We were talking just before we started recording this about where I fit in with identity, and people want me to put it in a neat little box. But the truth is that, I was raised by a Cree-Metis stepfather, and that I married an Inuvik man. I've been adopted by George Desjardins of West Moberly First Nation. So he is Cree, Daneza, and Soto. So that's a little complex there. And we do ceremony. It's a Lakota ceremony that we do at the Kainai Blackfoot. So now bring my children into the next generation, how they explain their indigeneity. It's complicated. And I think we have to make space for that. I see a lot of children who are mixed, of mixed ancestry, or and they might be mixed even in the different Indigenous nations that their ancestors come from. And even where I do ceremonies, we have people who are Cree, we have people who are Anishinaabe, but then they're doing Lakota ceremony with the Blackfoot, and it's okay, I think, for it to be complex. For Métis people, it can be very complicated to explain that, and how come you're not darker, and how come you look like this? One of my great heroes, literary heroes, would be Drew Hayden Taylor, who's phenomenal, but he's almost blonde, blue-eyed Anishinaabe guy who grew up on the res. But when he talked about one time he went to Germany, they flew him over there. They were staging a play of his, and they were so disappointed because he didn't look like what they thought he should look like. And I think that decolonizing that is something that we need to give to our children, but also our children aren't waiting to be given that. They're just taking it. And Tik Tok is just one great example how they are doing that.
Yeah, I love that they're just taking it. And I love the way you worded that. I love that.
I just love how it's almost evolved. The thought process has evolved. Like, going off of Jenna's story, mine, again, I'm Métis, very pale. More so people look at me as this tall white dude. And, because I'm almost 7 feet tall. I'm a very large, that's what they look at. And growing up, I knew I was Métis, but it wasn't talked about a lot. And, as I got older, I started learning more and more. Outside of school, I did not learn about residential schools and about Indigenous culture and stuff in general in schools, which I'm glad it's getting more and more into the curriculum now. But anyways, as I start learning more and more and asking my grandmother more questions, I remember the first time she got her Métis card. Her and my auntie got it, and they asked me to get it as well, and I refused. I did not want to. I almost felt like I went my whole life with this privilege of how I looked, and I almost felt like I would be taking away from people who needed, their card or needed the benefits from that card. And I think now it's almost a new chapter in my life, almost like turning 30 this month, having people in my life like Jenna who I can talk to about these sort of things, and we're kind of going through a similar situation where we're trying to find our identity. And then on top of that, now I have my auntie constantly texting me because she's looking at our ancestry, she's looking more into the culture, but then she's again trying to get me to get the card, and I just don't want to, because I just feel like I'm taking away, and I feel like I'm starting to get out of that guilt, but it's still there. And I remember also talking with my grandmother. She grew up with, her dad was Indigenous, her mom was Ukrainian, and their whole family, her brothers, had more facial features. They were darker skinned, whereas the women weren't. And even with that, they grew up in the 40s. Like, they were born in the 40s, grew up in the 50s, 60s. During the residential school time, they were able to avoid it. And I never asked her this, but our family, like her father and her mother, they never talked about it. Their family never talked about it. And it's just so interesting hearing from different perspectives. And I don't know if it was to dodge the residential school system, because I know she didn't go through it. But it's just hearing these stories, it's, for me in my journey, it's helping me grow. And, again, harping back to like social media and hearing stories like Jenna and yourself, Christy, it's just, I feel a relation to it, and it's kind of helping me grow too. And I hope that continues for the new generation as well.
Yeah, it was a survival mechanism, really, to not talk about it, whether it was because of residential school or child protective services, or even just being accepted in your community. After the Red River Rebellion and whatnot, you had a choice. You either, for a lot of people, you either went more Indigenous and kept that way of life, or you moved, further west or maybe back east, but you tried to fit in as white, because, up until really recently, everybody was considered to be traitors. I'm a generation, we grew up hearing that Louis Riel was a traitor, which I don't know, it's like that. So when you are Indigenous in passing or involved in Indigenous community and living in the settler world, you're like privy to a lot of experiences that other people don't necessarily have. People say racist things in front of you. You go to school and you're being taught things that don't seem quite right to you. I think it's important even for people who are passing and feel like they have privilege to stand up and be counted and reclaim that. Our government goes off a lot of statistics. The colonial world goes off statistics, and it still continues part of the erasure. If they make you feel that because you have privilege, you shouldn't stand up and be counted, then they say, well, the Métis community's dwindling. And the truth is, if we look at it in a really colonial way of blood quantum, eventually that blood is going to be diluted. And if you're passing and you choose to not identify as Indigenous, eventually they're just going to erase Indigenous people. So
that's a good way of looking at it. Yeah.
I think if that's your community and who you belong to, you need to stand up and be counted so that it can't be erased.
If I'm going to be totally honest, I would say there's definitely a level of shame to it. Like growing up in the 90s, it obviously the language was different back then, but Indigenous peoples were portrayed in a very negative light.
Oh yeah.
And it was like, why would I want that? And that's very privileged for me to say because I'm white and I was able to not have to, say anything that I didn't want to. And I don't know, it's just so complicated. And I look back and I'm like, almost like ashamed of my younger self. But then I'm like, no, I just was doing what was in the moment. That was life in the 90s.
Yeah. And what I see a lot with racism is, and I've seen this like with my ex-husband, for example, who's done really well, made a good name for himself, like working in the oil patch, and how many times people will say things to him like, I don't really think of you as Indigenous, like you're white, you're cowboy. So people who want to be racist, they tend to think of those people who are unhoused, people who are having struggles with addictions. Well, they're Indigenous. But the people who are being successful, well, they're really white. And we see a lot of this going on. Even if people aren't conscious that they're doing it, they are. It's important for everybody who's Indigenous to stand up and say, I'm Indigenous, because that helps break down those confirmation biases that people are having. When people you're interacting with know you're identifying as Indigenous, it makes it a little bit harder for them to start weighing people on this side and people on that side.
Going off of exactly what you're saying, it's just kind of clicking because my experience is very similar to Jenna's growing up. North side of Edmonton, though, it was very multicultural, right? I did have Indigenous friends, but when there was something going wrong, when there's crime in the community, where was the finger pointing, right? But it wasn't my friends. They're doing this over there. And I think that's the mindset that's now people are getting away from it more and more so. And, looking at the RCMP and just people in authority, now people are pointing the finger at them to, stop what they're kind of doing.
Relearning almost.
Yeah, that's systematic racism. Mm-hmm. So it's just great with what time we're in right now.
Well, I think even in our community, some of the people we consider as like the founding pioneers or people who've been very successful business people, people sometimes don't even realize that those people are Indigenous. Like they might belong to the Fort St. John Métis Society, for example, or but they're not telling everybody else. It's I guess something you go around and broadcast. But there's a lot of really successful people that a lot of other people don't realize. People outside the community don't realize that those are Indigenous people, and so they want to perpetuate that stereotype that everybody Indigenous just living off the government and all this, and they don't realize how much of our economy is driven by people who are visibly and non-visibly Indigenous. here. I think people would be pretty shocked if they understood how much of the wheels turn in this community because of Indigenous people.
Well, and I think there's also so many misconceptions, like with Métis, for instance. Like when I was growing up, I always, like, I heard the term half-breed a lot. I didn't know, like I had also heard a lot that Métis wasn't considered to be, I guess the wording now would be Indigenous. So it was very confusing growing up, not even really fully knowing like what it meant. And there was not really any information for me to even kind of go for. I don't know. It's so interesting. There's so much more to identity now than there was growing up. Like, sorry, you go ahead.
I was just going to say, going off of what you're saying, it's almost like in certain communities, and it seems similar from where you grew up in Cranbrook to Edmonton, is almost like people were instilling fear into us about Indigenous people. Like, not knowing that I'm Métis and thinking I'm just another white person. That's like
I
they're
would
instilling
say
it.
instilling fear on a lot of things, like sexuality.
Yeah, exactly.
Big time. That was a big one. I mean, we had one gay person in my whole school, right? And obviously there probably was more at the time, but he was the only one that was out. And so I think there was just shame and fear driven in a way because they wanted us to be a certain way.
It's a tool of colonization to try and make everybody very homogenous and the same. And if you are an outlier of that you will be punished severely by society for that. And part of that is creating confusion around what does it mean to be Métis, what is Métis, disconnecting you from that ancestral knowledge of what that means. The other thing is creating the stereotypes like the Pocahontas and then teaching that back to people who maybe haven't had access to their community. You see a lot of younger generations, if they've been disenfranchised from their cultural heritage because of things like residential school, that sometimes are being taught back in books or movies or even in the school system, something that's totally not accurate to who they are and where they come from. For example, like Sherman Alexie talking about how when he was growing up, what they learned about Indians, they rode around on horses and, wore headdresses, but he came from salmon people. And so that creating that confusion around identity is part of colonization. If you're confused around your identity and you don't know where to connect in, you're not getting proper answers, your best and safest bet is to assimilate with that homogenized community because you don't know where else you fit. So if you want to fit and belong, and as humans we're all driven to fit and belong, then you're going to try and fit in as best you can with settler community because you feel like you're flailing out here and you don't know your culture. So the more that we bring back Indigenous culture, revive, uncover what the elders have been holding for us like all this time and make sure that our children get that knowledge, the less that they're going to feel that pressure that they have to. And I don't think that having diversity is a bad thing at all. We tend to, I don't know, sometimes there's like this feeling that we all have to like, because we're on the same train and headed, the same route, that we all have to be exactly the same. But when we bring different frames of knowledge and knowing in, that's where the real magic happens. You look at the Renaissance, that had largely to do with influences coming largely out of the Middle East, but also out of Asia, and then mixing with European knowledge. And that's what enabled the Renaissance and all the technology and science and arts that we still revere today and still use today, coming out of that mixing. So I think it's important for us to keep Indigenous cultures alive so that we can learn from that. And the track we're on right now as a society is not going very well. So going back to some of those teachings from the people who have always been here could really drive us in a much better direction, I think.
The Indigenous culture is obviously a big part of who you are. What parts of it really speak to you the most? Like,
there's so much of it. I think that one of the things I love is that there's a place for everybody, and with like individual diversity, that there's so much space for that. I don't know. I think that that's just so important, that there's a place for everyone. There's a place for people who are really good at hunting and like to go out and do that. And there's a place for people who are good at telling stories. And there's a place for somebody who's a good firekeeper. There's just a place for everybody. And even people who might have what we call disabilities, or I have children who are neurodivergent, there's a sacred place for them. There's a sacred place for people who are two-spirit, people who are trans. There's positions for everybody. And also the thing that I love is actually an Anishinaabe word, Debowin. It means truth, but there's a lot. It goes a lot deeper than that. But one of the principles of Debowin is that we all have our own truth, and those truths are all valid. Like, more than one truth can exist at once, because we don't all live the exact same reality. And I really like keeping that in mind when I'm trying to communicate and deal with other people, especially my children. Teenagers tend to get called really dramatic, and it gets easy to forget that what they're going through actually is like, they've got half the life experience. They've got like all these peer stresses and social stresses, and
it's a lot. Yeah.
And to remember that
Puberty.
my children are not being dramatic, and their truth is that life is pretty challenging for them in this day and age, and what they're going through and developing. So that's one of the things that I love, is that inclusion. But to say just in indigeneity is kind of hard, because specific things belong to specific cultures and there's specific teachings. And I've been really blessed to have elders from many different cultures and being able to get some great teachings from different areas.
One of the reasons, it seems to be the main reason you wrote the 4 books with Margaret, was for your children. I was looking at a CBC article a couple weeks ago. It was based off the reception from the visits with the Pope. And one of the names was Waylon, your son, yes, who had spoke. And I just, after reading Fatty Legs, after reading some of the old interviews you have done in the past and talking about your children, and then to see him speaking in the article, it seemed full circle. He's 16 years old. He seems very intelligent in the culture, and he almost seems like he's a future advocate if he's not considered one now. What's your feeling like knowing that not only is Margaret a hero to your children, but 12 years after Fatty Legs in general, her legacy's living on, and she might be potentially a hero to other children that you might never even meet?
Yeah, it feels kind of overwhelming at times. I'm really proud of my son. I had mentioned pre-recording that he doesn't really do that well in school, but this is his place where he fits in. He has been mentored since he was a very young child. I took my children on the road with us a lot. He's been mentored from a young child to carry his grandmother's stories and to advocate for that. So he could easily get up in any presentation that we would give, even when he was like 8 years old. We probably didn't have to show up. He could have done it all on his own. That's been really inspirational to see. And my children all have different ways that they have kind of picked up the torch and expressed that themselves. One of the really phenomenal things that we found going to different schools is so we'd like to think in this day and age that children have a pretty easy go of it. There's the odd child that's being abused, but we don't think of children in general as having these same kinds of struggles. And we've heard absolutely heartbreaking stories. I remember one little girl, Métis, she had long red hair, but very Métis, and she had been adopted, and her adoptive mother shaved all her hair off when she got her because she had lice. And you know, how hard is it to comb the lice out? And then her adoptive family so when we went to go speak in the school, the adoptive family, and I think this girl's maybe in grade 3, the adopted family had just sent her back. They put her back into care. They said she was too much, and she was just so sweet. I imagine her, it sounded like her school teacher was going to maybe end up eventually having her, but heartbreaking. So Margaret was able to talk to her, and she had very sensitive teachers. So we set aside time outside school visits for Margaret to talk with her and just give her some hope. Like, you know, I was going through tough things when I was your age, and now look where I'm at. We met one time we were doing a school visit in Vancouver, and we had this one boy. It was like a group of boys sitting together. We had this one boy who kept asking questions about the violence. You know, sometimes kids are a little morbid and wanted to know about the abuse. We didn't talk about physical abuse in detail in school visits, and he was just like, you know, did the teachers hit you? Were you beat with sticks? And Afterwards, the school principal explained that those boys grew up in an Iranian refugee camp. They were from Afghanistan, and their teachers regularly beat them with sticks. And he said that, like, if they got called to the office just to be checked in on, they would like start bowing, and they would be like so scared that the principal was going to hurt them. And so through hearing Margaret's story, they were seeing themselves in that story. And you just never know what children are going through. Children are pretty good at hiding abuse, but also we have a number of refugee children coming from all sorts of backgrounds, and the amount of children who shared their stories with us and what they got out of Margaret's story and how they were seeing that for hope for themselves. I know that really filled Margaret up. Pre-COVID, when we do school visits, sometimes we have a gymnasium of 500 kids, and we would be late for the next school visit because the kids would just like impromptu make this huge lineup, and every kid would have to hug her on the way out of the gymnasium or the auditorium, and it'd be like an hour of her hugging every kid and then like trying to rush to the next school visit where she's just going to hug all the kids again. And so for some of them, that might be the only hugs, safe hugs that they were getting.
So what would you say to, like maybe there's a teenager listening right now that might be struggling with their identity and who they really are. What would you say to that child now?
Well, I think for anybody, but for some people, their journey is going to be bigger. Struggling, that mediation, the balance between what the outside world expects and who you are in yourself. I saw Margaret do that her whole life. She actually turned it into a superpower, though, where, like fashion, she loved fashion. Lots of people in the community probably have her beadwork and things she made, where she would mix tradition with, more settler style things or more modern things, negotiating that way. There's always going to be that negotiation. You can find your way, like Margaret, to do it on your own terms, and how that's going to be. For some people, that's going to be to, it's going to be, it's difficult, but I think there's a way that, like for Margaret, she found her way. I guess this is what it is. You can find your way through to finding where it can be your superpower, negotiating who you are and bringing that to the outside world, but always leaning heavier on who you are inside. Identity is a really difficult thing, and it's a really personal thing, and hopefully you'll be able to find your own sense of community to support you and to give you that backing. I know I have my youngest child is trans, and I really hope that the example of their grandmother taking life on her own terms will show him how to navigate that, or at least be strong and tell people off when they need to be told off. I think that's where Indigenous culture is really beautiful as well, where you've got this whole nest of community. Nothing happens totally individually. Colonization has broken some of that, but I hope for children struggling with gender, sexual identity, even, with racial issues, whatever it is, that they can find their nest. You might not be born with your nest, but if they could find their nest and their community ecosystem that's going to keep them and support them, you don't have to do it on your own.
Yeah, I think holding space, is what I notice the most when I'm in the Indigenous communities or speaking with. It's like there's just a little bit more space, a little bit more time in between answering questions. It's just a little bit more holding space. And if you can find those people to hold that space for you, I think that's what you need.
Yeah, it's one of the beautiful things I find about ceremonies. Maybe one of the things I'm most grateful about with the ceremony I do is a very tough ceremony, physically, mentally, spiritually demanding. And sometimes you see people just doubled over in tears, letting go of traumas that who knows how long they are. And nobody comes by and says, talk about it, tell me more about it. Or they don't say, suck it up, and, hand you tissue and you're just supposed to wipe away the tears. I mean, if you do get a tissue, that goes to the sacred fire, and those tears are sacred. People just come by and they say, just let it out. Just let it out. They don't ask you what you're crying about. They don't ask you what you're getting upset about. They just stand there and support you and hold the space for you and keep you feeling safe so you can let it out. And I think that's just such a beautiful thing we can all learn from, is just make space for people to express what they need to express.
Yeah. And I think on that note, thank you so much for doing this with us. And We've really wanting to have this conversation for a while, and you're so the perfect person for it. So thank you so much for doing this. So that brings us to our last question, which is, what does reconciliation mean to you?
Probably I'm more cynical than most of the answers that you're going to get. I believe in reconciliation as a grassroots movement, not as a government or a corporate catchphrase. I have very little faith in that. I think it's just morphed kind of in hiding another form of colonization. But I think the youth are making and taking, not asking for it, not waiting for it. They're not waiting for an apology. They're just making and taking their spaces to be Indigenous and to negotiate their identity on their own terms. And reconciliation, as I have known it, has been very grassroots. So I think of one of the very first people in this town, Crystal, very beautiful teacher who reached out to me when Fatty Legs was first published, wrote a lesson plan around fatty legs and was like curious and needed to get this into schools. And then I started having people all across Canada reaching out, all across the world reaching out to write lesson plans. These were teachers that were not waiting for reconciliation. They didn't wait for the They didn't wait for the recommendations to come out. They didn't wait for mandates and school boards to vote on it.
Curriculum to change, kind of thing.
They just found any way that they could slip it in, whether it was like through a novel study, it was in free reading time, wherever they could slip it in, they did. And they were asking me, what other resources can we use? What other books would you recommend? They started doing their own research, and it was very grassroots. And that is how I've known reconciliation, even with the people, Indigenous peoples, like Margaret's community. They put together a healing circle, and this was before the Truth and Reconciliation Commission happened. They put together a healing circle, and it was somewhat of a school reunion, but people sat and they decided they were going to support each other and share their stories. And this has happened everywhere. Confirming that the bodies are at these schools, that's been organized by the communities as grassroots. So it will be the grassroots settler community connecting in with grassroots Indigenous community and making, and the youth especially, and the connection between the youth and elders. They're going to make make reconciliation on their own terms, but as a government mandated thing or waiting on an apology from the Pope, I don't put much faith in any of that.
Okay, well, thank you. I love that answer. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Christy.
Thank you.
What an absolutely deep episode I felt. It was wonderful talking with Christy, and again, like we said in the intro, she was just such a great choice to talk to about our identities, and it's something that I find we needed to do. Like, I wanted us to open up a little more, and with any of our listeners, we want you to see a little bit into why we're doing this. We haven't completely explained. We did in the first episode with Gary Oker, the first episode of the podcast. We did it briefly because we do want to lend voices to Indigenous peoples in the Peace region, for those who don't know. But as well, we're the ones doing this podcast. We're human beings. We're going through things, and I think it was just so important to put that out there as well.
Yeah, and we're just wanting to let you guys in a little bit more and show you a little bit more about who we are.
One way of doing that is going to our social media accounts.
Yeah, you can follow us on Twitter. My handle is at Jenna Morland, JennaMorland, and Tre's, because he doesn't even know what his handle is, I'll read it out for you. It is at Tre Jordan, TreJordan.
Since we did a selfish plug, let's do a selfless one and name some of the books that Christy Jordan-Fenton and her mother-in-law, Margaret, OleMaun, had co-authored together. One of them is When I Was 8. The other one is Not My Girl, A Stranger at Home. And the last book which we talked about at length, that was one of the main books we touched on because Jenna and I had both read it before meeting with Christy, was Fatty Legs.
Yes, and I think everybody and their children, obviously for appropriate age, should read this book. It's very important. And yeah, you can definitely pick it up at Kohl's,
internet, wherever you get your books, they should be there.
Make sure you guys subscribe to Before the Peace using your favorite podcast app or at Energeticcity.ca/podcasts.
If you have a guest or program idea, email before the piece at moosefm.ca.
Toodaloo.